Hey everyone, welcome to week 19, day 5, Friday. And throughout this week, we've explored the possibilities that these colors that we usually associate with colors that we make our ground with, or we tone our paintings with, or we make grisailles with, like underpainting colors. We're trying to see them as color, and we're trying to explore all the possibilities of expression that they can offer to us. So we've used on Monday, just titanium white and ivory black. On Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we introduced raw umber, but we've tried to use different qualities of that raw umber. Just yesterday, we really tried to model that head through just kind of wiping out and just then leaving it be. And it's a beautiful kind of glowing, warm, kind of yellowish brown sort of hue when you treat your raw umber that way. So today, we're actually going to use raw umber in a totally different way. And hopefully that'll show us like a very broad range of possibilities that we have with, again, like last week, just 3 colors. We could work with these 3 colors for the rest of our lives and they would be absolutely amazing. So let's see how that goes. Remember, next week, we're going to be here and it's going to be a whole new theme. Bah! Okay, let's get started. Now for this last day, I thought we would do something a little bit different because throughout the week, we've been exploring the possibilities that we have with the contrast that's available to us by using our lightest light in the palette, which is titanium white, and sometimes our darkest dark in the palette if we choose to include ivory black or raw umber, which they are the same value. So in essence, we have a palette that has a value range that extends from the lightest light available to us to the darkest dark available to us. So we're going to have the possibility, if we choose to, should we choose to use the broadest range of values and tones in order to achieve the richest form of contrast. We've spoken a lot before about how our human eye just absolutely loves contrast. It gravitates towards contrast, specifically the contrast that has to do with value. Now, last week, we explored the contrast that's available to us through complementaries. That's a contrast that solely has to do with hues, but it doesn't have to do with value. But if we are thinking in terms of values of how light something is or how dark something is, our mind's eye, our perception just absolutely loves when something very light is right up against something that's very, very dark. It eats it up. It's absolutely delicious. A couple of days ago, we were talking about Robert Motherwell and Franz Kline, and those paintings are deeply, deeply impactful and powerful because they are huge masses, abstract masses, shapes of white against shapes of dark. When we decide to take advantage of value, of the broadest range of value that's available to us, we are actually harnessing this very, very powerful tool. And particularly for painters like myself that are interested in narrative art, art that wants to tell a story, then using value to tell a story is an insanely powerful tool. You see that in photography, in cinema, and you see that in painting, and it's not something that's new about painting. This is something that's been happening for hundreds of years. Now, regarding value, I was speaking yesterday about how Eugene Carrier was the painter that actually almost fried my brain when I realized that you could compress your value scale. I thought that was impossible. I thought that by doing that, you were really sacrificing way, way too many things. If you realize that using properly, which is very hard, the broadest range of values that are available to you and using contrast to tell a story, to enhance storytelling, is such a powerful device that is inherent to the nature of image making, why would you choose to make it seemingly weaker by eliminating the possibility to use contrast? That's what my mind always thought. Why would you want to sacrifice this? This is such an incredible part of painting. It doesn't make sense to sacrifice it. That's what you rationally think. But when you see very powerful images that are constructed upon a restricted value scale, and you see them work and they move you, then you realize, wow, I couldn't comprehend how this could be done. But when I see it, I realize how incredibly strong it is. So I said yesterday that Carrière was solely responsible for making me realize that that was possible, that that wasn't just something that was capricious, but it was a tool that was available to me. And that by making that restraint a little bit tighter, you weren't really sacrificing anything. It's not like you couldn't paint. No, you could make paintings, but you just had to be aware of the things that you could do and the things that you couldn't do. And the obvious thing that you couldn't do was to work with contrast. And I think I accepted that almost immediately. I was willing to gain atmosphere and mood, and I was conscious that I had to sacrifice contrast to do so. And I loved it. I am totally convinced that those things work when we stop fighting against them, when we actually accept them, and when we acknowledge that there is strength, there is inherent strength to those sacrifices. It doesn't mean that you are making a lesser painting because you're not working with your full arsenal. No, it can actually be quite poetic. Now, this is the tough part. It has to make sense with what you're trying to say. I mean, you could always just translate everything into a shorter value scale, and that can be quite beautiful. But ideally, you want your intent to kind of fit into all these formal decisions that we're making. I remember that while it was Carrière that was the painter that almost wrapped all of these things together for me and presented me a painting that was incredibly strong and a painting that moved me. When I was looking back, I realized that I have always loved these sort of paintings, always. Let me try to explain this. What I would usually notice is that moments where painters restricted their value scale to speak about atmospheric perspective, because that's the one thing that the shortening of your value scale was traditionally used for, it would only be in certain areas of the painting that would depict something that was happening far away. Or it was an episode of the painting that would separate what was happening in the foreground, which was very important and contrast heavy and saturation heavy, with the stuff that was happening in the background, where almost all of the color choices and the value choices had to be subdued when compared to whatever was happening in the foreground. Think about this as kind of like layers in a theater. In the foreground, you would have to have access to all your hue range and all your value range. You would especially want to have things that were saturated, pointing at your center of interest. But in the background, you wouldn't want things kind of popping their head out and trying to catch your attention. No, that was exclusive for the moment that was highest in your hierarchical scale. That was the exclamation point of your painting. But you wouldn't want to just paint exclusively what was your exclamation point. You almost have to build a sentence so you could finish with an exclamation point. So surrounding all these moments that had contrast and saturation and all these beautiful hues was atmosphere, was air, was a sense of space, a sense of place. And usually you could depict a ton of things that were going on in the background or happening in a different space within the painting. So if you cross that threshold, that could be a door or a frame, light would be affecting a little bit differently what was going on back there than what was happening in the foreground. And this is very, very important. So what you would see traditionally was like, for example, in this Velázquez in Las Hilanderas, is that there is a story taking place in the foreground and there's a secondary story taking place in the background. But the background, again, can't just fight for the attention with the narrative that is going on in the foreground. So Velázquez had to control his values, reduce his hues. So it would be a very, very simple kind of light, dark representation of form. But that sacrifice was super, super important, just so you would understand that the space was actually divided into two areas and that you could travel through them and you could actually feel that there was a sense of atmosphere that was affecting one area and it differed from the area that, in the case of Las Hilanderas, was that open, lighter background. And I remember just loving that. I don't know why. I don't know exactly why, but every time I would see a painting, my eye would just, yes, obviously go to the places where the painter wanted me to go, but I would also kind of veer off to the places that were secondary, that were really not that important. And to this day, I still love those tiny little moments of paintings because I've always referred to those little spots in paintings, and sometimes they could be large areas of a painting that are secondary areas. They really aren't that important, but you have to solve them, and you have to solve them intelligently. So whenever I would see those areas, I would be super excited to see how somebody could devote time and make something precious out of something that was seemingly unnecessary. But when you thought about it, when you really thought about it, it was absolutely necessary. All those things that would be happening in the background were super important. And I remember at the Met, I would have the same inclination when I saw Tiepolos. Of course, with Tiepolo, it was bound to happen because illusionistic ceilings. So he had to speak about atmosphere. He had to be absolutely conscious about the almost like sculptural quality of air and how it could affect the figures that were a few feet back. Light was seemingly so bright that the darks within that lightness would never be able to compete with an area that had access to full contrast. And because I became so sensitive to that, I understood that that was, again, a narrative tool, and that painters during the Baroque were using that tool, and illustrators during the 20th century were using that tool. So you would also get Norman Rockwell in his absolutely famous, incredible barbershop painting doing exactly the same thing. The foreground has a ton of contrast, and it's actually a darker space, and it has to be traversed just so that you can get to this room, that back room in the barbershop where the guys were actually practicing and playing their instruments. And of course, Rockwell was just incredible at understanding that he had to use value to help you traverse through the image. So you understood that you had to go through all the barbershop just to get to that back room. And you even had like a little torch, a little guiding light that was symbolized by those burning coals in that stove. And you knew that you had to get through that little light that was telling you, hey, this is the right way. Follow this little trail just so you could get to that room. That was absolutely genius of Rockwell. While this one is a little bit measured, he would do that also with just temperature. So in this painting, he uses just the coolness of the foreground to separate it from the warmness of the inside of the house. So you can kind of peek through this window and have an idea of what's going on, but you realized how much warmer it felt when compared to the coolness of the background. And in his newsstand painting, also very famous, he actually goes nuts with that. And he just really, really separates just blue and orange. But again, those things spoke about separation. It spoke about that first plane of the painting trying to separate from that second plane, from that background of the painting. And one of them was higher in the hierarchical scale. One of them was more important to you as a viewer. You would have to land in one of them. You would have to traverse one of them to get to the other, or you would land on the bigger mass that had contrast and saturation, and then you were kind of aware peripherally of all the stuff that was happening surrounding those moments that were actually important. But I started thinking, well, what if those things that we're not supposed to look at were just the whole painting? What if the desire to compress value had nothing to do with atmosphere or with making something secondary, but with bringing all those extras in the movie that nobody cares about? What if you brought them to that first plane of the image and it was about them? It was about the literally gray kind of nature of them, of this subdued nature of them. But I always thought, if they have nothing to be subdued against, what happens to their nature? What happens to the qualities that are inherent to them? And I love that. And I explored all those possibilities of representation for many, many years, trying to just depict paintings that were basically just really hard to look at. Not hard to look at because the subject matter was just trying to push you off, but just it was very hard to land on something. It was very hard for us as viewers, and even for me as a painter, to say, yeah, this is what's important about the painting, because in a way, it was just a very homogenizing act where everything just became the same. In image making, we usually have to be aware of what we're trying to say, and we have to find devices or dynamics to try and emphasize those very things that are important. Our narrative depends on the manner in which we're able to enhance those moments. But I always thought, well, what happens if our story is literally muted? I still love those questions that arose when I realized I wanted to paint that way. And I think I still hold on to a lot of those things. And from time to time, like today, I always want to see what happens if I bring a little bit of that back. And what happens if that grayness, that sameness affects not all of the painting, perhaps, but specific areas of the painting. And for this painting specifically, I thought it would be interesting to paint a painter that I think is, I mean, in my opinion, in my honest and humble opinion, I think she's the best painter that has ever come out of a kind of traditional contemporary classical atelier program. And she's Colleen Barry. I think she is the absolute best painter to have come out of that process. I think there's something about her painting that is just very hard to pinpoint. But if I try to make an effort and say what it is, it's just that I think her paintings have a soul to them. And I have no clue what that means. I really don't. I can't explain it. I can't quantify it. I really don't know where that lies. There's something intangible. There's something that you can't quite grasp when you see a painting of hers. There's a humanity. And by humanity, I don't mean that humanity comes naturally to those people that paint beautifully other human beings. No, there's a ton of people that are incredibly talented, that have even more ability than I could ever imagine, and whose work is cold to me. And they are beautifully painted paintings, but I don't sense kinship when I look at them. I don't feel like the people that are there belong to what I understand as human beings, as representations of our species. But when I look at Colleen's work, it's there. It's just absolutely there. And by there, again, I mean, I don't know where that is. It's not about eyes. It's not about features. It's not about, I don't know. I don't know where exactly that lies in, but she has it. And that to me is just something that very, very rarely happens when you look at other paintings. And I admire that profoundly. Again, I think she is one of the best painters of our generation, for sure. And I thought I would do this very small painting to, yes, to acknowledge this wonderful painter, but to also imagine that a lot of those things that are intangible. So I wanted to speak about that inability to grasp that concept by the overall grayness that's almost enveloping the whole of Colleen, and how that shape that is actually kind of encompassing her form has this beautiful then contrast with the crispness, the purity of that primed linen. It's a very, very, very simple painting. And today we're actually even making smaller that kind of playground that we can paint in just by saying contrast is going to be significantly lowered, and within the form, there's almost going to be no contrast, maybe one step, a step and a half worth of contrast. And the overall contrast is going to be this value, this shape that has this value against this very raw background. It was just a simple mass of grayness against a simple mass of lightness that was signified by the ground, and that was it. And that was it. And again, it speaks about simplicity. And that was actually the anchor for our whole week, because that's the attitude that we have to have should we choose to see every expressive possibility that this limited palette has to offer. That was it for this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, as we always say on Fridays, Danny and I are super grateful that you let us be your company. And we invite you next week, where there's a whole new theme, and we're going to try to tie something that we're doing this week, specifically something that's going on with this painting, with Colleen's painting, for next week. And I think it's going to be a super kind of wacky, strange week. Very tough in terms of technique, but I think it's going to be a blast. So I hope we'll see you guys next week. And again, thank you for hanging out during this week. So we'll see you guys later. Bye.